They humiliated her in front of everyone, and the quiet cowboy didn't say a word, not until it mattered. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your town or state below, and if you believe respect doesn't come from a name but from a man's actions, stay with this story. The wind moved slow across the dry ranch, carrying dust that settled on everything like it had nowhere else to go, and Ayanna Redbird stood near the water trough with her hands still, eyes lowered, trying to make herself smaller than the moment that had found her, while laughter drifted behind her, low and sharp, not loud enough to be called cruelty, but enough to be felt in the bones, and no one stepped in, no one ever did, because out here, silence was easier than standing alone, except for one man, standing about 20 feet away, hat low, shoulders relaxed, as if none of it concerned him, as if the world could pass right through him and leave no mark. Ethan Cole, the quiet one. The one they barely noticed unless they needed something done right and done fast. The one who spoke less than most and watched more than anyone realized. And in his hand, loose at his side, was a small piece of silver, a chain worn thin with time, catching just enough sunlight to flicker once, then disappear again. And Ayanna saw it, just for a second, something familiar in the shape, in the way it rested against his fingers like it belonged there long before this place ever did. And she looked away quickly, because questions had a way of costing more than answers out here. And the foreman's voice cut through the air again, steady, practiced, reminding her where she stood and where she didn't. And still, Ethan didn't move. Not yet. Not when the words came. Not when the others shifted closer. Not when the space around her grew tighter, like a circle closing without anyone admitting it. And then it happened, small enough that most would miss it. Ethan lifted his head just slightly, not enough to challenge, just enough to see clearly. And the men closest to him felt it before they understood it. Something in the way he stood, something that didn't match the role they'd given him, something older than this ranch, older than their voices, and for the first time, the laughter didn't sound as certain, and Ayanna felt it too. Not safety, not yet, but a pause, like the world had taken one breath and was waiting to see who would break it first. And in that silence, she realized something she couldn't explain. The quiet man wasn't invisible. Not really. He was just waiting. The wind did not move for a long second, like even the air was waiting for someone to decide what came next. And Ayanna kept her eyes low because she had learned that looking up at the wrong time could turn a moment into something worse. But she could feel it. The shift, subtle but real, like the ground under her boots had changed just enough to notice. And somewhere behind her, a man cleared his throat, not loud, not confident. Just enough to break the edge of that silence that had settled too, heavy for comfort, and the foreman adjusted his stance, rolling his shoulders as if reminding himself who he was supposed to be in front of the others. But his voice, when it came again, did not carry the same sharp edge. It dragged slightly, like it had to push through something unseen, and Ayanna noticed that, even without lifting her head, she noticed everything now, the way boots shifted in the dust, the way no one stepped closer, the way the circle that had formed around her stopped, tightening, and then she heard it. Not words, just the sound of leather creaking as someone moved, slow, deliberate, and she knew without looking who it was, because no one else on this ranch moved like that. Like time did not press on him the way it pressed on everyone else, and Ethan stepped forward just enough to stand within the same space as her, not touching, not shielding, just there. And somehow that was enough to change the weight of the moment. And one of the younger hands glanced at him, then quickly looked away, like he had seen something he did not understand and did not want to admit. And the foreman let out a short breath, forcing a half smile that did not reach his eyes, saying something about work that needed doing, about time being wasted, about everyone having better things to do. And one by one, the men began to move, not quickly, not all at once, but enough to break the shape they had made around her, enough to pretend that nothing had happened at all, and the dust picked up again, light and dry, settling back into its usual place over everything. And Ayanna finally lifted her head just slightly, not toward the others, but toward the man standing beside her. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because words felt too large for what had just passed between them. And then Ethan shifted his hand, just enough for the silver chain to catch the light again. And this time she saw it clearly, the small carved piece at the end, shaped in a way she knew too well, something from her people, something that did not belong on a man like him. And her breath slowed, just a fraction, as questions formed where fear had been, and he did not explain, did not offer anything more than a single glance, steady and quiet, before turning away like the moment had already ended for him. But as he walked, the space he left behind did not feel the same. And Ayanna understood something she had not known before. This place, this ranch, it was not held together by the loudest voices or the strongest hands. It was held together by something quieter, something no one spoke about, and somehow, that something had just stepped forward and then disappeared again, leaving everyone else to pretend they had not seen it. That evening came slow, the kind that stretched long across the land like it had nowhere else to be, and the heat of the day settled into the wood of the buildings, into the dust beneath every step, into the quiet spaces where no one spoke unless they had to. And Ayanna found herself near the edge of the corral, hands resting lightly on the worn fence rail, watching the cattle shift in slow patterns that made more sense than people ever did. And she told herself she was there for the air, for the distance, for the silence. But her eyes kept drifting back to the far end of the yard where a single figure moved with steady purpose, alone as always, and Ethan worked like he did everything else, without rush, without show, each motion measured, each step placed like it mattered even when no one was looking, and that was what unsettled her, not what he did, but how he did it, like the world around him was something he chose to step into, not something he belonged to. And she watched as he lifted a saddle, checked the straps, adjusted a buckle with fingers that knew the shape of the leather without needing to see it. And when he finished, he did not call out for approval, did not glance around to see who noticed. He simply stepped back and let the work speak for itself. And something about that pulled at her. Quiet but persistent. Like a memory she could not quite reach. And before she could decide whether to turn away or step closer, his voice came, low and even, not directed at her at first, just a simple question about the fence line needing repair by morning. But when he turned slightly, his eyes met hers, and the rest of the world seemed to fall just far enough away that she could hear her own breath, steady but aware, and he nodded once, small, acknowledging her presence like it had always been expected, and she stepped closer without thinking, boots pressing soft into the dirt, stopping just a few feet away, not too close, not far enough to feel distant. And for a moment they stood there, the sound of cattle shifting behind them, the creak of wood under the cooling air, and she found herself looking at his hands again, at the silver chain now resting against his shirt, and she spoke before she could stop herself, asking where he got it. Simple words, but heavier than they should have been. And he did not answer right away. Just let the question settle between them like something that needed to be weighed. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried no defense, no hesitation, just truth held back at the edges, saying it was given to him a long time ago, and that it was not his to lose. And that was all. No story, no explanation, just enough to make the silence deeper, and Ayanna felt something shift again. Not fear this time, not uncertainty, something closer to recognition. Like the pieces of a story she had not been told were starting to find each other. And she realized then that Ethan Cole was not just a man who kept to himself, he was a man who carried something unseen, something that tied him to a place he did not speak of. And as the last light of the sun faded behind the hills, casting long shadows that stretched across the ranch, she understood one thing clearly. Whatever he was hiding, it was not weakness, it was choice, and that made him more dangerous than anyone else here. The night settled deeper than usual, pressing a quiet weight over the ranch that made every sound carry farther than it should, and Ayanna lay awake on the narrow cot inside the small bunkhouse, staring at the ceiling where cracks in the wood traced lines like maps she could not read, and sleep did not come easy, not after the way the day had bent around something she still could not name, and outside, the faint rhythm of boots on dirt passed once, then again, steady and unhurried, and she knew, without looking, that it was him, because no one else moved through the dark like they had all the time in the world, and she rose without making a sound, stepping out into the cooler air where the smell of leather and dust softened under the night breeze, and the moon hung low, casting pale light across the yard, enough to see shapes, not enough to hide them, and Ethan stood near the far fence, hands resting on the top rail, looking out toward the open land beyond the ranch like he was, measuring something no one else could see, and she hesitated for a moment, then walked toward him, slow, careful, stopping a few feet away as she had before, and this time he did not turn right away, just spoke into the quiet, saying the land looked different at night, like it remembered things people tried to forget, and his voice carried something heavier than before, not louder, just deeper, like it had roots. And Ayana felt it settle into her chest in a way she did not expect, and she asked him what he meant, simple, direct, because she was done pretending not to notice the things that did not fit. And he exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that came from somewhere far back, and said that land does not belong to people the way people think it does, that sometimes it holds names long after they are no longer spoken, and she felt her fingers tighten slightly at her sides, because those words were not spoken like a guess. They were spoken like memory, and she looked at the chain again, at the small piece resting against his chest, and this time she did not look away, and he noticed. Of course he did, because he always noticed, and his hand moved just enough to touch it, not to hide it, not to show it, just to acknowledge it was there, and for a moment, the distance between them felt thinner than before, like something unspoken had stepped closer, and then the sound of a door slamming somewhere behind them cut through the stillness, sharp enough to break whatever had been forming, and voices followed, low but urgent, carrying the tone of men who had remembered something important too late, and Ayana turned her head toward the noise. But Ethan did not right away, and when he finally did, his posture had changed, not in a way most would notice, but she saw it, the quiet ease, replaced by something more defined, more certain, like a line had been drawn where none had been before, and one of the ranch hands approached, stopping a few steps away, speaking quickly about a situation near the main house, about a decision that needed to be made, and Ayana caught the words without understanding them fully, but she understood the shift in tone, the way the man spoke to Ethan not as an equal, not as a superior, but as something in between, something careful, and Ethan listened without interrupting, without asking questions, just absorbing it all like he already knew what the answer would be. And when the man finished, there was a brief silence. And then Ethan gave a single nod, small but final, and the man stepped back immediately, like that was all he needed. And as he walked away, Ayana remained still, her thoughts moving faster than her breath, because she had seen it clearly now, not in pieces, not in guesses, but in truth forming right in front of her. The quiet cowboy was not waiting because he had no place. He was waiting because everything here already moved around him, and she realized, with a slow certainty that settled deep, she had not been standing beside a man trying to belong. She had been standing beside the reason this place held together at all. Morning came without asking permission, pale light stretching across the ranch like it had business to attend to, and Ayana was already awake, standing near the well with a bucket in her hands. Though she had not drawn water yet, her mind still turning over what she had seen the night before, the way men spoke to Ethan when they thought no one important was listening, the way he answered without raising his voice, without needing to repeat himself, and she told herself she might have imagined it, that maybe she had read too much into a quiet moment, but the feeling did not leave. It settled deeper, like dust that refused to be brushed away, and as the ranch stirred to life around her, boots stepping out into the yard, horses shifting in their stalls, the low murmur of morning work beginning, she noticed something else, something small but undeniable. People looked toward him before they acted, not openly, not enough to admit it, but enough that it changed the rhythm of everything. And Ethan moved through it all like he always had, carrying a saddle, checking the fence line, speaking only when necessary. But now she saw the difference, the pauses around him, the way conversations bent when he passed, the way even the foreman adjusted his tone just slightly, just enough that only someone watching closely would catch it. And Ayana found herself watching closely, more than she meant to, more than she should have, because knowing too much in a place like this could cost more than it gave. And still, she could not stop. And when Ethan crossed the yard, heading toward the main house, she followed at a distance, not hiding, not approaching, just keeping him in sight like she was trying to understand the shape of something larger than herself. And the main house stood quiet, larger than the rest, its wood darker from years of weather and care, the kind of place that held decisions inside its walls. and she had never been closer than the edge of its shadow, not until now. And Ethan stepped onto the porch without hesitation, without asking, like the space belonged to him in a way that did not need to be spoken, and one of the ranch hands already standing there straightened as he approached, speaking quickly, handing over a folded paper, and Ayanna could not hear the words, but she saw the way Ethan unfolded it, read it once, then again, slower, his expression unchanged but his presence shifting, like something inside him had aligned with what he saw. And then he folded it back, not hurried, not careless, just final, and gave a quiet instruction that sent the man moving immediately. No argument, no delay. And Ayanna felt her breath catch just slightly, because there it was again, that invisible line that separated him from everyone else, not by force, not by fear, but by something steadier, something earned or chosen. She could not tell which. And when Ethan turned from the porch, his eyes found her without searching, like he had known she was there the whole time. And for a moment, neither of them moved. The distance between them filled with everything she had begun to understand and everything he had not yet said. And she realized then that whatever truth stood between them now, it was no longer hidden, not completely, it was waiting, just like he had been, for the moment it would no longer need to be. By midday, the sun pressed down hard enough to flatten shadows, and the ranch moved in that slow, steady rhythm that came when everyone pretended nothing had changed. But Ayanna could feel it beneath the surface. The way conversations paused a second too long when Ethan stepped into view. The way instructions carried his shape even when spoken by someone else. And she tried to return to her work, hauling water, mending a torn cloth, keeping her head down the way she always had. But the world did not fit the same anymore. Not after what she had seen. Not after what she could not unsee. And when the foreman called out her name, sharp but controlled, she walked toward him without hesitation, stopping a few feet away as he handed her a task that should have belonged to someone with more standing, something near the storage shed behind the main house, a place she had never been asked to go before, and she nodded without question, because questions had never been her place. And as she turned, she felt eyes on her, not mocking this time, not dismissive, just watching, measuring something they had not measured before, and the walk to the shed felt longer than it should have, each step carrying the weight of the morning with it. And when she reached the door, she hesitated just long enough to notice the quiet, deeper than the rest of the ranch, like this corner of the land held its breath, and she stepped inside, the air cooler, filled with the scent of old wood and leather, and shelves lined the walls, organized in a way that spoke of care, not neglect, tools placed with intention, records stacked neatly, nothing left to chance. And as she moved further in, her eyes caught something that did not belong with the rest, a ledger left open on a small table, its pages filled with writing too precise to be casual. And she did not mean to look, but her gaze fell across the lines anyway, names, numbers, boundaries, land markers, all written in a steady hand that did not waver. And at the top of the page, one name appeared again and again, Ethan Cole, not as a worker, not as a note in the margin, but as the one who signed, the one who decided, the one who held it all together in ink and quiet authority. And her breath slowed as the truth settled fully, not as a suspicion, not as a guess, but as something undeniable. And she stepped back from the table, not out of fear, but out of understanding, because this was not something meant to be stumbled upon. It was something revealed only when the time was right. And the sound of footsteps outside the shed brought her back, steady, familiar, and she turned just as Ethan stepped into the doorway, filling the space without effort, his presence calm, unchanged, as if nothing had shifted at all. But his eyes went to the open ledger, then back to her, and in that single glance, everything unspoken between them came into focus, and neither of them rushed to speak, because there was no need left for pretending. And Ayanna realized then that whatever line had existed between them before, it was gone now, replaced by something clearer, something heavier. And as the light from outside stretched across the floor between them, she understood one final thing. He had not hidden who he was because he feared being seen. He had hidden it because he wanted to be known without it first. The space between them held longer than it should have, not tense, not fragile, just heavy with the kind of truth that did not need to be spoken out loud. and Ayanna stood still beside the table. The open ledger no longer just paper and ink, but something that had shifted the ground beneath her feet, and Ethan did not rush her, did not step forward to close it, did not offer explanation like a man trying to defend something. He simply remained where he was, one hand resting lightly against the doorframe, as if giving her the choice to speak first or to walk away. And that choice alone told her more than any words could have, because men who needed power usually reached for it. They filled silence, they controlled the moment, but he did none of that, and that was what made the truth settle deeper. And finally she spoke, her voice steady but quieter than before, asking why, not accusing, not demanding, just a single word that carried everything she had begun to understand. And Ethan's gaze shifted slightly, not away from her, but inward, like he was measuring how much to give. And when he answered, it came slow, deliberate, not rehearsed, saying that people listen differently when they think you are one of them, that they show you who they are when they believe you have nothing to take from them. And Ayanna felt that land between them shift again, because she knew that truth, had lived it in a different way her whole life. And she asked another question, this time about the chain, about the piece that did not belong to him and yet never left his side. And he looked down at it briefly, just long enough for the memory behind it to surface. Then back to her, saying it was given to him by someone who taught him what this land really meant, someone who did not see him as an owner or an outsider, but as a man who could choose what he protected. And his voice did not rise, did not harden, but it carried something older than the ranch itself, something that made the air feel still again. And Ayanna's fingers moved slightly at her sides, because she understood what he was not saying, understood the weight of a gift like that. And for the first time, she looked at him not as a mystery to solve, but as a story she had stepped into without knowing. And outside, the sounds of the ranch continued, distant now, like they belonged to another place entirely. And Ethan finally stepped forward, not closing the distance all the way, just enough to reach the table, his hand moving to the ledger, closing it with a quiet finality that did not feel like hiding, but like marking a moment that had passed. And when he looked at her again, there was no change in his expression, no expectation, just the same quiet presence that had been there from the beginning. And Ayanna realized then that nothing about him had changed, not really. Only her understanding had, and that made everything feel different, because now she could see the line he had drawn, not to separate himself from others, but to protect something they did not even know they were standing on. And as she stepped back toward the doorway, the light falling across her path, she knew one thing with certainty: whatever came next would not be decided by what he owned, but by what he chose to do with it. And for the first time since arriving at the ranch, she was no longer just surviving the place, she was watching it unfold. The rest of the day did not return to what it had been, even if everyone pretended it did. And Ayanna stepped back into the open yard with a different weight in her chest, not heavier, not lighter, just clearer, like the dust had settled enough for her to finally see the shape of things. And around her, the ranch moved in its usual rhythm, men working, voices low, tools striking wood and leather. But now every sound carried a second meaning, something underneath, something unspoken. And she noticed how often eyes followed Ethan without turning heads, how decisions seemed to ripple outward from wherever he stood, quiet and unannounced. And she understood now that power did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it stood in the background until the right moment came, and then it simply existed, undeniable. And as she walked past the main house, she caught fragments of conversation. The foreman speaking to another man in a tone that tried to sound certain but fell short, mentioning boundaries, mentioning a group coming from the North Ridge, people who had been seen near the edge of the land. And Ayanna slowed her steps just enough to listen without being seen listening, her heart tightening slightly at the words, because she knew what that meant, knew who traveled those paths and why. And before she could move on, the door opened and Ethan stepped out, the conversation cutting short as both men straightened instinctively. And he did not ask what they had been discussing. He already knew. It showed in the way his gaze moved toward the horizon for a brief second, then back to them. And he gave a quiet instruction, something about leaving the ridge alone, about not approaching unless invited. And the foreman hesitated, just for a moment, like the old habits of control were pushing against something he could not quite challenge. And then he nodded, because even he understood the line that should not be crossed. And Ayana felt something shift inside her again, deeper this time, because this was not just about a ranch, not just about land or work or authority. This was about something that existed long before any of it, something Ethan was choosing to honor without ever speaking it aloud. And as the men dispersed, carrying out his words without question, he turned slightly, his eyes finding her where she stood half in shadow, and there was no surprise in his expression, no curiosity, just recognition. Like he had expected her to understand this part too. And she did, more than she wanted to admit, because she had seen men take land, claim it, reshape it until nothing of what came before remained. But this was different. This was a man standing in the middle of something he could control, choosing not to take more than what was already his. And for the first time, Ayana felt the distance between her past and this place begin to close, not completely, not enough to erase what had been, but enough to make her stay where she stood instead of walking away. And the wind picked up again, light and steady, carrying the scent of dry earth and something older beneath it. And she realized that whatever was coming from that ridge, whatever would test the balance he had been holding in silence, it would not stay unseen for long, and neither would the truth of the man who had chosen to stand at its center. The ridge did not announce itself with noise. It appeared the way everything important did out here, slow, steady, and impossible to ignore once seen. And by late afternoon, the first shapes formed along the horizon, small at first, like shadows stretching longer than they should, and Ayana felt it before anyone spoke of it, that quiet shift in the air that carried more meaning than any warning. And around her, the ranch began to change without admitting it. Conversations shortened, movements grew more deliberate, men drifting closer to the main yard without being told, as if instinct pulled them inward, and still, no one said the words out loud. No one named what they all saw building in the distance, because naming it would mean choosing a side, and choosing a side meant stepping into something that could not be undone. And Ayana stood near the edge of the fence, her eyes fixed on the ridge, her breath slow but steady, because she recognized the way those figures moved, not hurried, not aggressive, just certain, like they had every right to be exactly where they were. And behind her, Boots approached, stopping just close enough to be felt, not heard, and she did not need to turn to know it was him. And Ethan stood beside her again, the same distance as before, neither closing it nor widening it, just sharing the space as if it belonged equally to both of them. And for a moment, they watched in silence, the land stretching between the ranch and the ridge like a line drawn long before either of them had arrived. And then she spoke, not asking this time, just stating what she already knew, saying they would not turn back. And Ethan nodded once, small, like he respected the truth of that more than any plan he could make. And the figures grew clearer as the sun lowered, not many, not enough to threaten by number, but enough to carry weight, enough to be seen. And behind them, the ranch hands gathered without forming a line, without raising voices, just waiting, because they had learned something without realizing it, that when moments like this came, they did not belong to the loudest man, they belonged to the one who did not need to speak first. And Ethan stepped forward then. Not quickly, not dramatically, just one step that shifted everything. And Ayana felt it like a change in the ground beneath her feet, because this was no longer the quiet man standing beside her. This was the man the land itself seemed to recognize. And he walked a few paces ahead, stopping where the yard met the open stretch of dirt, the place where one space ended and another began. And he did not call out, did not signal. He simply stood, waiting, and the figures on the ridge continued their approach at the same steady pace, not slowing, not testing, just moving forward like they already understood what would happen when they reached him. And Ayana remained where she was, her eyes moving between the man she had come to understand and the people she had never forgotten. And for the first time, she realized that this moment was not about conflict. It was about balance, about whether the line between two worlds would hold or break. And as the distance between them closed, the wind carried a familiar scent, something from her past, something that did not belong to the ranch, but had never left the land. And she knew then that whatever happened next would not be decided by strength or fear. It would be decided by the choices made in silence, the kind that defined a man long before anyone ever learned his name. They stopped 10 yards apart, close enough to see each other clearly, far enough to keep the line between them unbroken, and the world seemed to narrow to that single stretch of ground where dust hung in the air like it was waiting to settle on whatever decision would be made next. And Ethan did not move beyond where he stood, his posture steady, his hands loose at his sides, nothing in him reaching for control, nothing in him stepping back, just a man holding his place as if that alone carried meaning. And the figures from the ridge came to a stop as well, their presence calm, measured, not pressing forward, not retreating, simply meeting him where the land itself seemed to draw the boundary. And Ayanna watched from behind, her breath slow, her chest tight with something she could not name, because she recognized the silence now, not as emptiness, but as language, the kind spoken without words between people who understood what was at stake. And one of the men from the ridge stepped forward slightly, not enough to challenge, just enough to be seen as the one who would speak if words became necessary. And Ethan inclined his head, a small acknowledgement that carried more respect than any greeting spoken aloud. And for a long moment, nothing else happened, no raised voices, no sudden movement, just two sides of a history standing across from each other, held together by a line that could be broken with a single wrong step. And then Ethan reached into his pocket, slow, deliberate, his movements clear, and he brought out the silver chain, letting it rest in his palm where the light could touch it. And the shift was immediate, not dramatic, not loud, but real, like a ripple passing through still water. And the man from the ridge saw it. Of course he did, his gaze settling on the small piece of silver with recognition that did not need to be explained. And Ayanna felt her own breath catch. Because this was no longer about ownership or boundaries. This was something older, something carried forward through people who chose to remember. And Ethan did not offer the chain, did not extend it. He simply held it there, visible, like a truth placed between them. And the man on the ridge took one step closer, stopping just at the edge of that invisible line, his eyes lifting from the chain to Ethan's face, searching, measuring, not for weakness, not for power, but for something deeper. Something that could not be claimed, only recognized. And whatever he found there was enough, because he gave a single nod, small but certain, and stepped back into place. And the tension that had held the air tight began to ease, not disappearing, but shifting into something steadier, something understood. And Ethan lowered his hand, the chain falling back against his shirt, hidden once more, but no less present. And he did not speak, did not give orders, did not claim victory. He simply turned, slightly, creating space where there had been none before. And that was all it took. The line held, not by force, not by fear, but by the quiet decision of a man who knew exactly where he stood. And Ayanna felt something settle inside her then, a certainty that had been building since the moment she first saw him standing still in the middle of chaos. Because now she understood fully, he had never been pretending to be less. He had been choosing to be enough. And that choice was what made everything else fall into place. The air did not rush back in all at once. It returned slowly, like the land itself was deciding it could breathe again. And the figures from the ridge began to step away, not turning their backs immediately, not in retreat, but in acknowledgement, each movement measured, deliberate, until the distance between them widened enough that the line no longer needed to be held. And the ranch behind Ayanna shifted with it, the tension breaking in quiet ways, men lowering their shoulders, voices returning in low murmurs that tried to sound normal, but carried something different now, something uncertain, something aware. And Ethan remained where he stood for a moment longer, watching the ridge until the last shape blended back into the horizon. And only then did he turn, not toward the main house, not toward the foreman, but toward the yard where everyone waited without knowing what they were waiting for. And he walked back the same way he had stepped forward, steady, unhurried, as if nothing extraordinary had just passed through that space. But the difference was there, impossible to miss, because now no one looked at him the same way. And the foreman stepped forward first, not with authority, not with challenge, but with something closer to hesitation, asking in a voice that tried to hold its old shape what they should do next. And Ethan paused just long enough to let the question settle, then answered simply, saying the ridge was not theirs to manage and never had been. That the work here stayed within the fences they built and the promises they kept, and nothing more. And there was no argument, No pushback, because the words carried a weight that did not need to be explained, and one by one, the men returned to their tasks, but slower now, more aware, like they had seen something that did not fit the story they had been telling themselves. And Ayanna stood where she had been, watching him as he crossed the yard. The silver chain hidden again, the quiet man. Restored to the place he had always held, and yet nothing about him felt the same, because now she could see the shape of every step he took, the way each choice connected to something larger than the ranch, larger than any of them. And when he reached her, he did not stop completely, just slowed enough that she could walk beside him if she chose, and she did, falling into step without needing to be asked, and for a few moments they moved in silence. The sounds of the ranch settling around them like something familiar but changed, and she spoke then, not questioning, not searching, just stating what had become clear, saying that he could have taken more, could have pushed them back, could have made it his in ways no one here would have questioned, and Ethan's gaze stayed forward, his expression unchanged, but his answer came with a quiet certainty that matched the land itself, saying that owning something did not mean you understood it, and that understanding was the only thing that kept it from being lost, and Ayanna felt that settled deep, because she knew that truth in a way few others here did. And as they walked, the distance between them felt different again, not smaller, not larger, just steadier, like two paths that had finally recognized they were moving in the same direction, and behind them, the ranch continued, the same fences, the same dust, the same work, but now it carried a silence that was no longer empty. It was filled with something that could not be undone, the quiet knowledge of who had been standing among them, all along, and why he had never needed to say it out loud. The sun dipped lower, stretching long shadows across the ranch that made everything look softer than it truly was. And the work slowed without anyone calling for it, tools set down a little earlier, voices quieter than usual, as if the land itself had asked for a moment to settle after what had passed. And Ayanna stood near the fence again, her hands resting against the worn wood, feeling the faint warmth left behind by the day. And for the first time since she had arrived, the place did not feel like something she was passing through. It felt like something she understood, even if only in pieces. And across the yard, Ethan moved as he always had, checking the horses, adjusting a strap, speaking a few quiet words to a young hand who listened more carefully than he had that morning, and nothing about his movements announced what had happened. Nothing in him reached for recognition, and yet it followed him anyway, not as fear, not as obedience, but as something steadier, something earned in ways that could not be written down in any ledger. And Ayanna watched him for a long moment before stepping forward, closing the distance without hesitation this time, and when she stopped beside him, he did not turn immediately, just finished what he was doing, letting the silence hold its place between them. And when he finally looked at her, there was no question in his eyes, no need to ask why she had come, because both of them already knew the answer, and she spoke slowly, choosing each word like it mattered, saying that people would see him differently now, that they would not forget what they had witnessed. And Ethan gave a small nod, not in agreement, not in concern, just acknowledgement, and said that people always saw what they were ready to see, nothing more, nothing less. And she studied his face for a moment, searching for something that might have changed, but found nothing new, only the same quiet certainty that had been there from the beginning. And that was when she understood the final piece, that this had never been about revealing who he was to others. It had been about whether he would remain the same when they finally saw him. Clearly, and the answer had already been given, not in words, but in every choice he had made. And she felt a quiet shift inside her, something settling into place that had been uncertain before, and she said that the land would remember this, not as a moment of conflict, but as a moment of restraint. And Ethan's gaze moved briefly toward the horizon, where the ridge had disappeared back into distance. And he said that the land remembered everything, but it only held on to what was honored. And the words stayed with her, deeper than anything else he had said, because they carried a truth she had always known but had never heard spoken this way. And as the light faded further, turning the sky into something softer, something quieter, she realized that whatever this place had been when she arrived, it was not the same now, not because the land had changed, but because the way it was being held had been revealed, and for the first time, she did not feel like she was standing at the edge of something today. She felt like she was standing within it, seen not as an outsider, not as someone passing through, but as someone who had chosen to stay, and in that choice, something unspoken had been answered, something that did not need to be said out loud, because both of them already understood it. The night came quiet, the kind that settled over the land like a promise rather than an ending, and the ranch rested under it, not asleep, not fully awake, just still, like it had learned something it needed to hold on to. And Ayanna stood at the edge of the fence one last time. The same place where she had once felt small, unseen, like she did not belong to anything but her own silence. And now the space felt different. Not because the land had changed, not because the people had suddenly become something they were not, but because the truth beneath it all had stepped into the light and stayed there. And she watched as the last lantern near the main house dimmed, the soft glow fading into the dark, and she could hear the distant movement of horses, the quiet shift of wood as the night air cooled everything it touched, and behind her, footsteps approached, familiar, unhurried, and she did not turn this time, because she no longer needed to confirm who it was, and Ethan stopped. Beside her, the same distance, the same presence, but there was no distance left between what they understood now. And for a while, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to reveal, only what remained after everything had been seen clearly. And Ayanna let her gaze move across the land, the ridge now just a shadow in the distance, the fences stretching out like quiet agreements drawn into the earth. And she said softly that most men would have claimed more, would have taken that moment and turned it into something louder, something that proved their place in the world. And Ethan's answer came the same way all his answers had, without force, without hesitation, saying that proving something and protecting it were never the same thing, and that the land knew the difference even when people did not. And she let those words settle, not questioning them, not needing to, because she had seen the truth of them with her own eyes. And the wind moved lightly through the open space, carrying with it the scent of dust, of leather, of something older that had never truly left. And she realized then that this place would go on as it always had. The work, the voices, the long days and quiet nights. But something had shifted beneath it, something that would not fade with time. And she turned slightly, just enough to look at him. And for the first time, there was no question in her eyes, no searching, only recognition. And he met her gaze the same way, steady, certain, not asking for anything, not offering more than what had already been given. And in that moment, the story between them did not need words, did not need promises. It existed in the space they shared, in the choices that had already been made. And as the night deepened around them, Ayanna understood what the land would remember, not the silence, not the tension, not even the moment on the ridge, but the man who stood in the middle of it all and chose not to take more than what was right. And she stayed where she was, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because for the first time, she knew exactly why she remained, and out here. That was all the truth a person ever needed.